Hey Maja, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's so fun to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name is Maja Sikorska, and I live and work in Gothenburg. I'm an artist working primarily with sculpture and drawing.
Can you tell us how you engage in your artistic processes?
I usually choose processes that take a lot of time. I like to spend a lot of time with the materials I'm working with, sort of to get into that sense of flow. Yeah, I like time-consuming processes because they allow me to really connect the material I'm working with, and I work intuitively, so I like to sort of find the form or the motif that I'm working with. I don't really plan anything out from the start. I want to be surprised and I want to find new pathways with the thing I'm working with.
How did you start your artistic journey?
Well, I always sort of liked to draw as a child, but like a career within the arts was never something that seemed possible. Then a friend of mine, he was an artist and he had been going to like art schools ever since he was a kid. So he's the one who sort of made it possible to me. His name is Godfrey and he's an amazing artist. There's something about having that support from a friend and somebody who sort of can show you the possibility of something.
When we shared our studio on Valand Academy, you had these huge black sculptures. I would really like you to speak about them and process how are you making those.
Yeah, so I was sort of exploring a space between beauty and abject, or something that sort of feels heavy. So I was working a lot with like a styrofoam as a base, and then just working different surfaces, making sort of voluptuous forms that look sort of corporal, like bodily forms, and painted them black. I usually do work with monochromes, and I use a lot of black in my art. There's something about sort of the purity in the monochrome, and it does have a certain sense of heaviness to it, so it worked really well with those forms. I wanted to create this sort of overwhelming feeling of something sort of mutating and spreading out in the room.
I remember when you were working with those big blobs of sculpture and they had a specific form. How much does improvisation, or not improvisation, but how much do you leave it to chance and how much do you actually start from your initial idea, and how do you work with these mistakes that artists make during their artistic process to get their artwork where they want it to be?
Like, I usually start with some sort of idea of maybe a size of the work I want to be working with and a certain gesture or movement. I mean, the works that we're talking about now, they're a little bit further back, so a lot has also developed over the years. Already then I was working very intuitively, so say that I had some general idea of a size and a gesture, a sort of a movement of the form, and then it is really intuitive work. It's not really chance as much in sculpture. It's more, at least for me, it's more like finding new pathways and sort of getting to a point where it doesn't really look like what you thought it was going to look like, and just stepping back and taking it in a new way and seeing like, where can it go now? What does it want to become? So not getting hung up on some sort of idea that you had in the start, but seeing like where it develops, all the while making choices. So it's not really coincidental in any way, but it is intuitive work based sort of on both a feeling and a reaction to the material and to the process of what's going on, but also sort of connected to a knowledge that is gathered over many years, working with different forms and looking, like just taking in a lot of different forms and looking at different materials. So there's this like relationship between not knowing and also knowing in your body. Knowing what makes a form dynamic, or if this part were to be bigger and this part would be lighter if it was tilted a little bit differently. You can see that if you spend enough time working with materials and forms and just looking at different shapes.
You spoke about beauty, and that's a very subjective thing, but what is a beauty for you?
That is very difficult to define, I think, because so many things can be beautiful if looked at in a certain way. I think that everybody has a certain aesthetic or a taste. I mean, there are definitely like certain materials and structures that I'm drawn into more than others. I think that beauty is really hard to define because anything can be beautiful if presented in a certain way or looked at in a certain way. I think that everybody has certain aesthetics or certain things that they are more drawn in by, more pulled in by, and I definitely have certain like structures or forms that interest me more. I don't know how to define beauty as a term. It's something that that feeling of getting drawn in, of getting interested. For me, I think that a level of abstraction really helps. Setting a certain kind of mood, when something is lit a certain way, or I look a lot at, dance. That's a great source of inspiration, and just like the mood and expression of emotions, that really sort of correlates to sculpture for me, and sort of the movement of a form. It sort of translates to what it would be like if a person were to express that movement, what kind of emotion that would evoke.
I was wondering if you can explain your sculptures now. It's totally different from these big blobs. Now they're hollow and empty. How did you make the decision to go from these forms, rounded forms, to something now that is hollow inside, and why?
I've noticed over the years that I have a tendency to sort of get hung up on certain forms for a time. For a time it was like these blobby forms, and everything I did sort of came out like that. And now it has sort of to do with the body all the time. Like I'm working with biomorphic forms, so the forms have become maybe more skeletal in a way. You can sort of see connections to anatomy or like muscle mass, or it can look like hair sometimes. Yeah, they have moved more into a space maybe closer between a body and something from nature, like a root system. It becomes like a connectivity between something bodily, something from nature, and maybe a material, like how a fabric flows. I'm sort of looking at these forms as the potential of something. So it's not like, well, here's a portrait and it's a face, or here's a tree, it's a tree. It's sort of like, let's make something that could become a face, could become a tree. But right now it's still at a stage where it's still deciding what it's supposed to be. It's almost like a seed. So there's still potential for something to come out of it. I feel like that's like staying in that space is very interesting to me. I feel that there's a sort of kind of tension, and it leaves so much room for imagination. And that's very interesting to me.
Can you explain what is your favorite material to work with and why?
I really enjoy working with many different materials, so I don't have a favorite. I don't really work with structures like building. I really like being very physically near the material, and like working with my hands. I like casting different materials. Like even when I'm working with drawing, I see it as it has to be close enough to the body. The structure of the paper or the pen has to be like fit in the hand as a tool in a way that feels like an extension of my hand. So I'm very particular with the sort of tools I use.
Do you make sketches or just sculpt?
I mean, I definitely have done some sketches that then became sculptures in a way. Of course, they never look exactly as they did in the sketch, because I would get too bored if I was going to try to make it the exact same. But usually, I sort of try to find the form within the material. I started working with ceramics last year, and I sort of found my way into my way of working with it. I prefer to work with like one big block of clay and sort of cut away pieces and then start forming it over time, rather than like planning a form or sketching out a form and then just building it. With ceramics, it also has to be in a way hollow, and that became very difficult in my kind of process, because if you don't know what the form is going to look like from the beginning and how it's going to lean, it becomes a bit more difficult to then sort of hollow it out. So I just finally began to work with like a block of clay and carving away pieces until I sort of got to the skeleton of what I wanted.
One of the greatest sculptors of all time, Michelangelo, he was always claiming that he found his David in the stone. So I was wondering, how do you find your forms and how do you find your sculptures in the clay or in the stone or whatever material you are working with?
When working with reductive process, like when you take away material, then I can really relate to that feeling of finding the sculpture and the form within a block of material. Then I also work with different sort of processes where you sort of shape a material in a different way, but it still has that feeling to me of finding the form within what you're working with. Even when I draw, I sort of sink into the paper. I usually work very detail-oriented when I draw. I sink into the paper and the work sort of comes out at me. So it's a rhythm between what is already on the paper and what is supposed to come out, what's not there yet. So you're sort of like imagining the next step while you're drawing a line. It feels a bit musical, like a rhythm to it.
You already spoke about dance, so now you spoke about music. So how much other art forms inspire you or influence your work?
For me, it's very connected, dance and music, or maybe I should say movement and music and art, sculpture, because it's setting a mood, it's working within a rhythm, connecting to a material. It's a very tactile thing. So for me, these art forms are very connected. I sometimes imagine that in a different lifetime I would have been a dancer. I think that there's many ways to sort of express this emotion or like this drive of it's very hard to even put words to it, but I see art as an imaginative act. You're making something that wasn't there before. You're making a connection between two different things that maybe wasn't seen before. We are imaginative beings, you know. It's something that you can see even in children. You're not taught imagination. If anything, it's beaten out of you sometimes. I find many different art forms very connected.
Connections between art and art forms are very important. How do you name your art pieces? Let's say you're going to make a horse and you say, oh, this is a horse and I'm going to make a horse and it's titled a horse. But how do you get to the names? And you have interesting names of your work, both on Swedish and English. Can you explain a little bit about that?
I definitely don't start out with a title or a theme. When I work with something, I connect to it and it becomes something. So I sort of have to meet the work when it's finished to see what it is before I can name it. I have many titles that are in English. Even when I was younger, I used to write a little bit of poetry, and that was also always in English. I think that has to do with just listening to a lot of music in English as I grew up. So it just became sort of, for me, the language of poetics, which is, maybe funny, but I just think in English when I think. For me, titles are maybe a little bit poetic because they're supposed to give you a sense of what it is, maybe not be completely descriptive, just give you a sense of the piece. I also like to sort of create my own words, combining different things. I had one that had that look of a movement. Also, there was this quality that looked a little bit like a tree trunk. So I sort of just connected two different words and called it dendromotion. I also have a couple of sculptures now. I'm making a sculpture series that they are called osteomorphs. So it's from the Greek. Osteo, it has to do with skeleton, and morph, so it's form.
Can you please tell us about your drawings of scratchboards?
Scratchboard is a very interesting material, I find. It's basically cardboard that's white, and then you have a black surface on top of it. And then you use some sort of tool. I use a scalpel, and you sort of scratch out the black so you get the white from underneath. I really like this sort of process because it is in a way very sculptural, because it's reductive, you take away material. Something about using a scalpel blade, it sort of makes you feel like there's something on the line, You become concentrated and focused in a different way, I feel. I work with a lot of with shading and making forms that are sort of organic and flowy, and if you accidentally scratch off too much, it becomes completely flat white. So it's a very, in that sense, difficult material, because if you make a mistake, you can't really cover it up, and then you just have to start on a new one. Although I have to say that unless you scratch off so it's completely flat, I do tend to think that quote-unquote mistakes are more like redirections. So I work a lot with maybe turning the image different ways and trying to find a new pathway into it if there's something that happens that maybe I didn't predict. It's a very fun material to work with intuitively.
There is one particular artwork that I found very interesting, and I would really like you to speak about
Osteomorphs.
I don't know how to pronounce it.
It's osteo, that's one, and morph.
Osteomorph. Osteomorph. I have a problem with the Greek language. I cannot pronounce.
I don't know Greek either.
What?
I don't speak Greek either.
Oh, by the way, how many languages do you speak?
3. I speak Swedish, English, and Polish.
For me, it's really hard to pronounce these weird, old Greek words. For example, there is this guy that holds a spear, and translation is the spear holder or spear bearer. Politeo, Koleo, something I can never pronounce. But anyway, can you speak about osteomorphose?
Osteomorphs.
Okay. Yeah.
The sculpture's osteomorphs. It started actually with sculpture that I made that was a wall sculpture. I made first in clay and then I cast it in resin. And it had this sort of quality to it that reminds you of sort of bone. But also there are parts that look maybe more like fabric. And it's a form that sort of connects to itself. There are holes or openings, but it's also connected. And I had this idea of something that was like from the inside and was connected and was like a structure, but also a bit like morphed or twisted in a way. And then I started making sculptures that are made in a different way with sort of an aluminum base. Then I've sort of like just worked with many different materials on top of it, doing sort of like a papier-mâché technique, but with more like filler and a lot of glue and many layers of like adding material and sanding it down, adding material, sanding it down. So it's a very time-consuming process. For me, it was really important to get the surface exactly right. So even like parts that you don't really see that well, they needed to be sanded down so that they were, to the touch, felt a lot like bone. I wanted a material that would feel porous, sort of like bone, and very light too. Like if you picked it up, it should be light. So that became sort of the development of that first wall sculpture. It became something different. They are sort of in the same family, and I want to keep on developing those sort of forms.
Would you ever consider doing industrial design sculptures like chairs and furniture?
I've never really considered it, actually. Now that you say it, I can see it too. This is actually one of my favorite parts about working with biomorphic forms and working with the level of abstraction, that sometimes people ask you, like, what is it supposed to be? But the best part are always people coming up and telling me, like, this is this, or I see this, or isn't this what you meant to do? And I love the fact that I can spend so many hours working on something and like building a bond with a certain piece. And then just a person can come in and just like in 2 seconds, they see something that I never did. It's one of my favorite things about working with these biomorphic forms, because I feel like they keep like evolving after I finish them. So even after they leave my hands, they can keep becoming something else. And I really enjoy that.
How do you react when people tell you, oh, this particular piece or that particular piece remind me of something, and maybe it wasn't your intention?
It just makes me happy. I don't start out with like a very clear idea or a theme, and I'm not married to any sort of concept that this should be read in this way. I work with a form or a motif, and it becomes something personal to me, but I also want it to be surface of projection for other people. You know, I'm very interested in psychology, and I find that abstract works can really be surfaces where you can sort of just see the piece in your own way. I feel like that allows a work of art to become something more, like it can contain so many different worlds and so many different perspectives. That just makes me happy when somebody sees something completely different in it than I intended.
I'm totally different from you. When I paint and somebody said to me, why don't you paint this particular piece like that, or that, or why there is no more red? I get really annoyed.
That is a different question though. Even though I might not have a clear idea of what it's supposed to look like from the start, I do feel like I am sort of stubborn, and I'm very clear at what is working and what isn't working every step of the way. The decisions I make are very clear to me. In the finished work, how you read it, for me, it doesn't take anything away from what I know to be the piece. I would also probably not take very well to like, oh, you should make this red. Like, okay, why? Everybody's entitled to their opinion, but I don't work in that way that I would remake my work to make it suit somebody else's idea of what it should be. Then I would just say, like, if you would like to see this kind of work in red, then you should make it.
No compromises when it comes to my art and my expression. I have to ask you, can you explain the process, not artistic process, technical process, for those who doesn't know how much it takes to make ceramics?
So I'm not specifically a ceramic artist, but I have been working with it the last year. For me, it takes a lot of time. As I said, I usually work like in a reductive technique with a big block of clay that I then carve out pieces out of and then sort of find a form, find a movement, find sort of like a skeleton of what I'm looking for. And it takes a lot of time because when you don't have like a figured out plan of what you're making and you haven't been making a form many times over, it takes a lot of time to like make different decisions until you like get to what you're looking for, because you're not even really sure what you're looking for from the beginning. I've done this like ceramic courses that are maybe like 10 times or something like that. And I can work on one sculpture. Sometimes I'll have time to make a second, but usually just the one. And I just keep carving at it. And I'm also sort of obsessive when it comes to surfaces. So if I want it to be like really smooth, I will work on that, like that one particular surface so long. I also like black clay. It's a really rough clay and it's very stable. Yeah, I really like the texture and the feel of it, but it's really difficult with like creating smoothness, which is also important to me. So I like a challenge.
One of the reasons why I started this podcast is to explain to people that art takes time. I was wondering, can you explain how much is time consuming for you? How much time does it take for you?
I choose very time consuming processes. It's difficult for me to say like exactly how long time something takes. When I work with a drawing, I usually don't tend to work on one drawing. I work on many different ones at the same time. For the last few years, I've been working primarily with permanent pens. A mistake can become a redirection, or it can become something that you can't really work into the image, and then you have to like just toss it and start on a new one. You can start with like 4 hours in one sitting, then waiting for a week before you're like ready to look at it again, and then maybe you sit for an hour or two, or you sit for 8. Different works take different amount of time. When I've been working with ceramics, I don't really have the opportunity to sit with it and plan out my time as I would like to, because I do it through courses. I also like the idea of working together with other artists or other people can be nice, because otherwise I'm just, alone in my studio when I'm working with everything else. So it's a nice change. For one sculpture, it's around 20, 30 hours. When it comes to the process, where it starts for me when it comes to like inspiration, I've always been a daydreamer ever since I was a kid, and I have this idea that we are beings of imagination. The way I see it, we have one life. I don't really believe in a life after this. For me, imagining things and stepping into your imagination, it's sort of like hacking your timeline. So for me, like imagining things has always been very important. And when it comes to like inspiration, I go for walks and I can look at like trees and imagine what it would be like if they twisted in a different way. I've spent a lot of time just looking at different objects and materials, sort of searching for the possibility in them and what would that be like. And I think that you can see that in my drawings and in my sculptures, that it's sort of a like reworking of reality.
How much is important for you to be inspired?
I don't really believe in waiting for inspiration. I think that it's through doing things, through actively looking, actively searching, starting to do something even when you don't really feel like it. You put yourself in a space where something can happen. So I find that when I am already working, when I am already in action, in movement, that's when I find something. That's when the inspiration comes. Whether it is to actually just start working on something, touching something, having something in your hands, if it's clay, if it's a pen, doesn't matter, or just like a bit of wire that you start twisting around until you can find some sort of form or something that looks interesting. But it can also be like just going out for a walk, listening to music, and just really zooming in on different parts, like this tree trunk. It's twisted in an interesting way. What if you made a drawing where you sort of took away everything around it, and then you would twist it a little bit more, imagining and reworking reality around you. That's a way for me also to find inspiration.
I'm like you in the sense that I never wait for inspiration. I always seek for it. Do you have these moments, because I do, when you are searching for inspiration, but you cannot find it? How do you find inspiration if you are always searching for it?
Don't really feel like I have moments when I don't have inspiration. It's more like I have definitely moments and sometimes periods of time where everything I sit to start making just doesn't turn out well. It doesn't have that thing, and I can't really put my finger on why. But it's not because of a lack of ideas or inspiration. It's really just like some sort of resistance, or you have bad days sometimes. I don't feel empty for ideas or empty for inspiration. That is all around all the time. It's just sometimes, for some reason, everything you do like just turns to shit.
I have 3 questions that I always ask people at the end. First one is, what is art?
Art is an imaginative act. Yeah, it's an act of imagination.
Second question is, how would you like to be remembered?
Oh God, I don't know that. I see it more in a relational sense. You know, of course, I know I'm making art. It's something that's supposed to sort of live on after I'm gone. But for some reason, like for me, it all comes down to like relationships, like how I am as a person in my relationships. That's what's most important to me, how people will remember me that knew me.
If you had the chance to have a dinner with somebody that you admire, artist, live or dead, or a character from a book or a film, who would it be?
I've been thinking about this question a lot, and I had such a hard time coming up with an answer, because I also can't like stop thinking about meeting your hero or something like that, and how it could be very disappointing, or how it can turn out that, you know, somebody living in a different culture in a different time could turn out to have some very outdated opinions. And so I don't know, like it would be really cool to like meet Jean Arp, you know, one of the fathers of biomorphism. You know, that would be cool. But honestly, like if I'm thinking about a dinner party that I would like to attend, it would be like George Carlin, Betty White, and Esther Perel.
Okay.
So it's a bit different.
How can we find you?
I have my webpage. It's my name, majasikorska.com. And I'm on Instagram with Maja_Sikorska. And for the spelling, I'm sure Eldin will put it there because it's a Polish last name. So
don't panic, we are Slavic. Thank you for finding time, and I'm happy that we did this. I hope to see you very soon.
Thank you so much for having me. I think that, you know, this thing you're doing here, this podcast, it's really great. And keep going, because this is so much fun. I've been having a lot of fun, you know, listening to your episodes, and it's really fun to be here. I hope this turns out well.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
This concludes this episode. I want to thank you for joining and listening. I hope we inspired you. I hope you learned something.